And Al's going to give us a little bit of a taste of the history and some of the things that Skunkworks done over the years, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions at the end. Of course, Al is the perfect person to present this, and I'm sure we all know Al Remig. He's the chief skunk right now at the Skunkworks, and his job is to ensure that the rich tradition and heritage of the projects at the Skunkworks continue, and they continue their work with a really highly technical, cutting-edge military aircraft, and he's also, Al, in addition to leading the Skunkworks, is a bit of a historian and share a lot of stories with us tonight. So Al, I will yield the stage to you, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, this is going to be a fun one. And certainly at the end, I hope that we have plenty of time for dialogue. I think a lot of people certainly have heard of the Skunkworks. The name has also become somewhat generic in the same way that people oftentimes refer to photocopy machines as a Xerox machine. The notion of the term of a Skunkworks for any hub of innovation has a term that's become quite common over the course of the last multiple decades. But I'll give you the history as we go through this of where the name Skunkworks actually came from if you don't know that story. I'll also give you a good reference that there have been a number of books written about the Skunkworks. In my view, the best one was written by Ben Recce and published around 1990, and it's just simply called Skunkworks. Ben was there from the very beginning. You can buy it on Amazon for about $10, so it's available in softback. I think the hardbacks are no longer in print, but it's a very, very entertaining read, and certainly gives you a good sense of and captures the flavor of what makes the Skunkworks tick. Well, first off, if I was going to give a talk on the history of the Skunkworks, a traditional talk, this would be one of the slides that I would certainly use, because what it shows you are the products, or the product side of what makes the Skunkworks the Skunkworks. A number of the airplanes that are up there, I think people certainly would affiliate or associate with us. They would think of the U-2, they would think of the SR-71, they'd think of the F-117. And those are all relatively recent in our history, to a certain extent. This one being this one's had a long career. The first models were built in the 1950s. The last ones were built in the late 1980s. Subsequent versions of earlier ones, we'll talk more about that as we move into this. This is a product of the 60s, and this is a product of the 70s and 80s. But there are other things that actually have happened to the Skunkworks over years that people may or may not know. It's also the place where all Lockheed prototypes are built. So if there's a competition for a new airplane to do whatever, that prototype will come from the Skunkworks. Many people may know that the predecessor to the F-35, the X-35, was developed in Palmdale, California at the Skunkworks. The YF-22, the predecessor to the F-22, was developed by the Skunkworks in Burbank, California. I'll explain the geography of that here in a bit as we go through that. One that a lot of people don't realize is that the C-130 also was born at the Skunkworks in 1954. And there's now over 4,000 units have been produced. Interesting little side story in the C-130 is that at the time that it was made, it was designed by a colleague of Kelly Johnson's by the name of Hall Hillard, but Kelly said, that airplane is so ugly you'll never sell more than 100 of them. And he wasn't very often wrong about things, but that's one that he was wrong about. But I'm not going to give you the standard Skunkworks talk that's focused on products. I want to give you one that's really focused on people. So this is really more like a tour through the family album of the Skunkworks that will give you really the full sense of our history. And obviously to do that, I've got to paint a bit of a history of Lockheed itself and then how that led to the evolution of the Skunkworks within Lockheed back during World War II. So first off, where did we start? Well, like a lot of modern aviation in North America, it started in California. If you go back and trace the history of the Lockheeds, Glenn L. Martin, Jack Northrop, all these things happened. Boeing, all happened in California. And in fact, even to this day, despite what some of the things you may hear about California with its taxes and its regulations, et cetera, it still is the largest employer in aerospace in the US. It doesn't have the same large lead over other states that at one time it had, but it is still, measured by number of people, dollars of revenue generated within that state, the largest aerospace state in the US, mostly in Southern California. Some space-related things that are up north, For example, our facility at Sunnyvale, but most, when you think aircraft, typically centered in Southern California. But it turns out that Lockheed, and I won't say anything more about the Glenn L. Martin company, the Martin part of Lockheed Martin today, but both the Lockheed brothers and Glenn L. Martin started their companies in 1912, both in California. So interestingly enough, in 2012, 2 years ago, we as a corporation got to celebrate our 100th anniversary. And I think if you go on YouTube and you put in Lockheed 100th anniversary, you'll see some of the tapes that were put together by the public relations group that will basically paint the history of where the two corporations went as they grew into one over the course of those 100 years. But in 1912, the Lockheed brothers, Alan and Malcolm, started a company that they called the Alco Cab Company, that their intent was to build airplanes. And what they built were flying boats. And in fact, you'll notice how it's spelled, because originally it was called, obviously, Lockheed was the name, but they called it the Alco Cab Company. That company existed from 1912 until about 1916. And in 1916, times got tough economically, and they went out of business. Well, shortly thereafter, they reincorporated. And this time it was the two Lockheed brothers, but also included other people who were relatively well-known in aerospace. Jack Northrop was their partner. And the company reformed in 1916, as I've said. And they decided that spelling Lockheed, that original way, would be a little bit difficult. So the original Lockheed aircraft manufacturing, it started out as Lockheed spelled like this, but eventually they decided that became too difficult, and later the name was changed to the more phonetic spelling of Lockheed. But when they recreated themselves in 1916, they actually wanted to stay in the flying boat business. They had an aircraft that was actually a relatively old design and thought they needed something more modern. They actually got together and bought a flying boat made by Curtiss Aircraft, and that became the model for what they thought would be an appropriate company, an appropriate product for them to try to emulate as they went forward. And so the Lockheed Aircraft Company was returned to the flying boat business during that period of time. And in that time, around 1921 or thereabouts, the largest shareholder of Lockheed, who was not any one of the Lockheed brothers or Jack Northrop, sold their stock in the company, and it became part of the Detroit Aircraft Company, but it was still the Lockheed division within the larger Detroit Aircraft Company. And they built some very fine airplanes. That was when the Vega was first born, for example, which in some ways is arguably a predecessor to the airplane that ultimately flew Amelia Earhart, later the Electra. But the Vega was a good airplane, but it was expensive. At about the same time they struggled with the expense of that airplane, the Great Depression hit in 1929, and the company went out of business. So we went out of business once in 1916, was reformed, bought out in 1921, went out of business again in 1929. And you can see, though, we already had moved from actually the first flight of this airplane happened in Long Beach. But somewhere in that interval, by the time they got to the 1920s, they moved their location to Burbank, California. So by the time we got to 1920, it was in Burbank, California. And it was operated actually on a site that we used up until the 1990s. Then when they went out of business in 1929, the company went defunct. And a few years later, in 1932, Robert Gross, along with a couple of his friends, came up with $40,000, worth about $660,000 in today's dollars, and they bought the now then defunct Lockheed Aircraft Company. What was interesting about it is that at the same time, the Lockheed brothers actually had $50,000 and were going to make an offer to buy it. But they thought the value was so lousy and so cheap that they decided that will never work. They won't accept the offer. So they didn't make the offer of $50,000, but the trustee accepted the offer of $40,000 from Robert Gross. And so he took the company called it Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, and added to it a number of other individuals that you'll see the names down here. Robert Gross actually is a name that's really associated with the birth of Lockheed. He was the CEO up until the early 1960s. He was around for a long time. And Hall Hibbard, as I mentioned once before, was the chief engineer. And those are probably the two names that are most associated with the birth of the modern Lockheed in 1932. How many people in here have seen the movie The Aviator? Right? Well, you recall there was a scene in there where there was a super constellation sitting in the hangar, and Howard Hughes is in the hangar, and two guys come in from Lockheed trying to close a deal on selling the Constellation to TWA. Those were the two people that are in that scene with Howard Hughes. It was Robert Gross and Hall Hibbard, who were the two most senior people in the company at the time that was done. So you've seen at least them recreated in a movie that's modern. So in 1932, the company was reborn. And at that time, we were not really when we're doing the flying boats were very interesting. We were certainly not the only ones who did them. In fact, the other half of now Lockheed Martin Marietta, the Glenn L. Martin Company, probably had a stronger foothold in flying boats in the early years than anybody else. Eventually, Boeing got a very strong foothold in flying boats as well. But in the early days, the Glenn L. Martin Company was probably the dominant flying boat company that was out there. And in fact, they were sold commercially as well as into military service. And there was also the notion to build land-based aircraft primarily for observation-type purposes, some lightly armed to the military. But it was a balance between military sales and commercial sales. But you'll notice as we went into World War I, and you looked at the airplanes that the Army Air Corps flew, they were for the most part French and British airplanes. Very few that were American aircraft, because by that time the Europeans had actually leaped ahead of us in the technology. But that was us now in the 1930s. And during the 1930s, some very interesting things happened. And I think probably one of the most significant things is it was in the early 1930s, it would have been about 1932, just after Robert Gross took over, they hired an individual from the University of Michigan. We have any Michigan people in the room? We hired from Michigan a young man by the name of Clarence L. Johnson. Well, somebody decided that he didn't look too much like a Clarence, so they said, we think you ought to be Kelly. And the name stuck ever since. But Kelly joined the company in 1932 as a bachelor's degree aeronautical engineer out of the University of Michigan. And one of the first things that he ended up doing, the predecessor, actually this is the military version up on the top, the Lodestar. This is a bomber version of that in the bottom later called the Hudson. I'll get into that here in a moment. But this airplane that was built, Kelly thought it was going to have instability problems. So he took the airplane back to Michigan. I think he was working on his master's degree at the time, put it in the wind tunnels, and lo and behold, the aircraft had the instability that he thought it was going to have. And he went back and he redesigned the airplane and went back to California with the redesigned airplane and new test data from the wind tunnel and took it to Bob Gross and Hall Hibbard. And lo and behold, it actually was a more stable aircraft. And all of a sudden, Kelly Johnson had gotten their attention. And Kelly's an important name in this whole story because, as you'll see, Kelly Johnson and the Skunkworks are almost synonymous even to this day. So the fact that I bring up that story about Kelly is really significant because it was his culture and his style that created and persists to this day at what we call the Skunkworks inside of Lockheed Martin. There's actually another interesting variation of that particular airplane that happens down here in the bottom. The British wanted a medium bomber. This is before the U.S. entered World War II. So we were probably around 1936 or 37. And the British wanted a medium bomber. And Lockheed thought, well, maybe we can make a modified version of this transport airplane, the Lodestar. It was actually also the Electra. We can make it into a bomber. And the British will buy it, a medium bomber. Well, he goes Kelly goes over to London and talks to the then MOD or the acquisition people, whatever the British called them at that time. And they looked at the airplane, but there were a lot of things about it they didn't like. So Kelly locked himself in a hotel room for about 2 straight days with his slide rule and completely redesigned the airplane. And then went back to the military in the UK. They liked the redesign and they bought it. And all during the war, that airplane remained in production in California primarily for what we would now call foreign military sales to the British. There was a naval version of that built that was used by the US Navy that's shown up here in the top that's called the Ventura, and it was used, as I said, for anti-submarine defense. But even though Kelly was a very creative individual with what he had done with the split tail, I made the comment about how he made the airplane more stable. The key change that he made was going from a single T-tail to this twin tail that was on the top. And it was through that and some other things he did to it that the airplane gained stability. But those were still all relatively conventional stories about aviation up until the 1930s. Yes, Kelly was very bright. Yes, he integrated wind tunnel data and computational analysis to change the design of an airplane. Yes, he did these crazy things like work for 48 hours straight redesigning an airplane in the hotel room in London. All those things are true, but none of them are particularly unconventional. Unconventional happened in the late 1930s. In 1938, the war was approaching, and the Army Air Corps said, we need a fighter that will fly faster than 400 miles an hour. And they came to Kelly at the Skunkworks, and he set about designing an airplane that would go faster than 400 miles an hour. And the airplane concept that he came up with later became known as the P-38 Lightning. And what's interesting about the P-38 is when he built it, I like to call this the preseason game for the Skunkworks, because he created an organization. He didn't call it the Skunkworks or Advanced Development Programs. It was just an organization that was operating completely in secret in the dark. He went around the Burbank plant and he picked what he thought were the best, about 30 engineers and support people from around the plant. He went to the corner of a hangar, put up some plywood walls, and behind those walls in secret, they built the P-38. In a matter of about, 18 months or so, from sometime in early 38 until mid 1939 when the airplane flew. And in fact, it did more than 400 miles an hour and was the first fighter in the inventory that was capable of doing that. It's also the only fighter in World War II that was in production from the start of World War II until the end of World War II. Went through a number of iterations, ending up with the J model. There were some special variants used for reconnaissance, but up through the J model, but in production from 1939 through 1945. It was the only bomber that did that. We built them in Burbank, and we made almost 10,000 of them when we were there. Now, an interesting trivia question for you. Do you know why today Lockheed has a plant in Marietta, Georgia? Why Boeing has facilities in Wichita, for example? Why B-24s were built in Fort Worth? Why the automotive companies built B-24s, Ford, as well as as fighters for the Navy in Detroit. Do you know why those cities were picked? They were picked because they were out of range of German and Japanese bombers or carrier-launched airplanes. So things were built inland at the same time. That was also done, by the way, in the nuclear weapons program. That's why we have Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, because they were far away from the borders and they couldn't be attacked from offshore. But the problem existed. Remember, I made the comment about so much of aerospace was in Southern California? Well, so were we. We were in Burbank. This created a problem. Well, if you've ever been to the Burbank plant, I'll show you some pictures a little bit later. If you've ever been to the Burbank airport, that's where the factory was. And it sprawled out for miles, kind of intermingled with the rest of the city of Burbank at the time. But that's very close to the water. It's probably, as the crow flies, 30 miles from the coast. And so what they did, they partnered with the Walt Disney Company, and they put nets over top of the site, and they painted it, and they put rubber horses and the like on the top of it. And when you looked at it from the air, what you saw was this. Underneath that was a factory that built 10,000 P-38s. It built Hudsons for the British, and under contract, it built Boeing B-17s for the Air Force. And at its peak, it employed almost 100,000 people, but it was hidden underneath the net. But in all of this, in the corner of a hangar, there was this plywood set-aside area where Kelly and his team built the P-38. When the P-38 was done, Kelly disbanded the group, took down the plywood walls, everybody went back to their job, and off they went. Here you can see some other things down on the bottom. Here you can see shipping some Liberty ships carrying Hudsons from Long Beach to the UK for assembly. This is earlier in the war, 50,000 people streaming in to work underneath the camouflage tents. And we're not the only company that claims this, and I certainly wasn't around to attest to its truth or not. But supposedly the role model for Rosie the Riveter worked at that plant in Burbank. But I suspect that there were multiple Rosie the Riveters around the country at the time. But I do know, now see if I can get the non-stage name right. Well, I won't even try. My wife would know this, but I won't even try. One of the riveters that worked in that plant during World War II later became known as Marilyn Monroe. And interestingly enough, the story's been passed down the line that when she came back in the 1960s for a visit, already now a famous movie star, that and Kelly gave her the tour through the place, that she remembered all the things that she had done and what station she had worked on during the course of the war. So an interesting little twist of history there. Marilyn Monroe was a Lockheed employee. Well, he went after the P-38 was done. He went back into his normal drill. And by the time we got to the mid-1940s, I think any of you that actually saw me talk this morning, I talked a little bit about the first flight of HE-178, the first jet-powered airplane that the Germans built. The British flew the Gloucester Meteor in, I think, 1942 or thereabouts. The Germans first flew the prototypes with the Me-262 in 42 or 43, and in fact, it went operational in the fall of 1944. But it was clear, there was a lot of reconnaissance efforts where people saw airplanes without propellers on the front of them. That before they started putting cardboard ones up front, where people knew there was something about this. They knew about the work that Frank Whittle was doing in the UK. Kelly himself began working on a design for an axial flow jet engine in Burbank in 1939. So people clearly knew that jets were coming down the pike. And once it was clear that the Me-262 was close to production, the British were already working on the Gloucester Meteor. The Army Air Force at the time said, "Oops, we better get on the stick too." The first airplane that was built by Bell. It's called the X-59. But the X-59 was really a technology demo airplane. It wasn't a prototype. It was just to prove that we could build an airplane with a jet engine in it. And they did. But it really didn't have, its performance was not remarkable. In fact, it would have been easy pickings for a P-38 or a P-47 or a P-51. It was not a high-performing airplane, but it did show that a jet engine could fly in the US. Well, the next step was to make an operational fighter out of it. And they came to Lockheed to build that fighter. And what did Lockheed do? They went back to Kelly Johnson. And what did Kelly do? He said, "I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the P-38. And when he did that, he created what he called Advanced Development Projects, at the time ADP, went around the plant, picked up about 130 people, engineers, fabricators, maintainers, etc., draftsmen, purchasing folks, etc., HR people, the whole bit, and he found a place to put them. And where he put them was actually in a circus tent that was across from one of the runways. And he put together a set of rules. Actually, his chief engineer did this. And I don't expect you to read these, except maybe for the top line that says Kelly Johnson's 14 rules. If you go and Google Kelly Johnson's 14 rules, these rules will all pop up. The reason I particularly I typically hate slides that you can't read. But the reason that I like to use this slide is at least people who are down in front will be able to see that at the bottom it's signed by Kelly Johnson. So one of my now directors, Steve Justice, who started his work at the Skunkworks in the early 1980s, was in the plant, and he saw Kelly, who kept coming in as a consultant, and he grabbed this thing off of his desk and he chased Kelly down the hall and caught him and asked Kelly to sign it, and he did. So the significance is these rules really were there, and by the way, we still live by these rules today. And if I gave you just a simple description of the 14 rules, they're really pretty much the rules of modern program management. And you can find them on the web. They're easy to find, but look them up sometime. And I will tell you to this day, we manage to those rules. And when some program has gone red and has gone off the tracks, I will bet you dollars to donuts I will find one or two of those rules where somebody got sloppy on how well they followed them. But those rules were put together to build the XP-80. So here we go. We're building this airplane. We're building it inside of the corner of a hangar, the outside of which is draped with a circus tent. And here the airplane comes together. And you can see, a wooden mock-up that's up here in the corner. Whoops, back it up. that's up here in the corner. Here you can see, this is the same picture I showed you before of Hall and Kelly looking at a sort of a prototype design underneath. Here you can see the XP-80 nose, and there's the tent that's covering the outer part of the hangar where they worked. And here was the first one that was right near completion. Now, a couple interesting stories about this and where the name came from. We were advanced development projects. And it turns out, people say, well, where the heck did the name Skunkworks come from? Well, here's where the name came from. It was during the middle of World War II. There was industrial production everywhere across the country. And down the road a bit from where we were located, I'm going to show you a map here in a moment, there was a factory that made plastic for the war effort. And it made a really bad odor, like a lot of chemical processing plants do, especially in those days. The other employees at Lockheed didn't know that it came from that plant. They blamed the crazy guys in the tent, right? So we were the ones who were making this really awful smell. Well, for those of you that are aware of a cartoon strip called Little Abner, in Little Abner back at that time, which took place in Appalachia somewhere, there was a backwoods still that made moonshine that smelled really bad. And in the cartoon strip, they called it Skunkworks with an O. You know, my supposition today is they were trying to imitate, how do you capture an Appalachian accent in a cartoon strip? That was how they did it. So one of the engineers, a guy named Irv Culver, thought that was really funny. And so he started answering the phone, Skunkworks, your man Culver here. Well, Kelly found out and fired him. Of course, he came back the next day. Kelly fired lots of people overnight. And they would come back the next day and everything was fine. But he did get fired overnight for using that term. But it was so entrenched and customers loved it, it just stuck. And then at the end of the war, whatever the franchise was that owned the Little Abner cartoon strip, today it's United Artists, but I'm sure back then it was somebody different. It was probably Alcap Incorporated or something. Said, you can't do that, that's a copyrighted name, it violates our copyright. So we changed it to Skunkworks and we copyrighted it. So, while it's okay, I think, for people to generically use the term Skunkworks for a place of innovation, if somebody else creates a facility or a program area and they want to officially call it the Skunkworks, they will get a friendly letter from the Lockheed attorneys telling them not to do that. You know, I think there's cases where maybe it would be licensed if it's viewed to be not competitive to it, but that's a copyrighted term that's used by Lockheed Martin, and that's the history of where it came from. Now, what about how we were located? For those of you that have been in Burbank or around Burbank, it's a sprawling LA suburb. The Burbank airport actually became the Lockheed airport when we bought it from whoever the original owner was. And in fact, a lot of that, there are still some hangars along the runway that belong to us. Most of the things have been torn down. They were built back, some of them in the 19-teens and some in the 1920s. But as close as I can get you to this, if you've ever been in Los Angeles and you've come down Route 5 from the north, when you're going through Burbank and Glendale, off on the side, if you're heading south, off on the side, you may notice, and you're the kind of people who might just notice what I'm about to tell you, and you notice along the side of a road a shopping, like an outlet mall looking place, where the signs that advertise the shopping center, one of them's a P-38, one of them's a U-2, one of them's an SR-71. I don't know if anyone in the room has ever seen. I know some of the locals have seen those signs. That was one of the factories during the war. At the end of that run, there's now an electronics store called Fry's, which you have to really know Burbank to know where that is, but it's right just a bit north of what I just described. That's where the hangar and the circus tent were, where it was done. There was a runway that went back behind it at the time. The airport today is off, oops, get back here, is off over here. But there was a runway that was just behind this. The airplane came out of there, and that was where it first flew out of. In fact, if you look today, you know, when we, for example, drive down to the Burbank airport, if we fly out of Burbank instead of LAX, and you drive in to go to the parking lot, you can actually look off to the side. You can still see, or you can see in like Google Maps, you can see the dark spots where some of the hangars, in fact, were. And so the Skunkworks at the end, after we moved out of the tent, was right next to parking lot A by the Burbank airport when you're there. But that was sort of what it looked like. We covered. There's a little bit of the story in the bottom. Kelly fired Herb, but he was back to work the next day. If he really got mad at you, he kicked you in the butt, really, and then he fired you, and then you could come back the next day. So what happened after that? Well, after the U-2 was built, after the P-80 was built, by the way, the P-80 made it to Italy in about January of 1945, although it never saw combat in World War II. But there was clearly a continuing demand for things, and so Kelly chose not to dissolve ADP in the Skunk Works, and it persisted. And although it went up and down in size over the years, there were times, one time it got as small as 7 people, right? There's other times, for example, during the 117 days, it got up to almost 7,000 people. Today in what's the R&D core, the Skunk Works today now includes a lot of things that are beyond my purview. They belong to a larger coordination unit. But the core of the Skunk Works that does the R&D part of it is about 1,200 or 1,400 people, right? And it never gets bigger than that typically, because once you win a program, things spin out and they go someplace else. But after we did the P-80, the next thing that came along was the F-94, which is an afterburning version of the P-80, a little bit faster than the P-80. The P-80 never saw combat. It actually became the F-80 after the Air Force was formed in 1947. Never saw combat in World War II. It does, however, have the first jet-on-jet dogfight kill in the Korean War. Even though it was an older airplane with a straight wing design, it shot down the first MiG-15. It was the first MiG-15 shoot down by a jet. The first U.S. shoot down of a MiG happened to be a Corsair, but the first jet-on-jet dogfight ending with an American victory was done in a P-80. Then after that, there was this issue about a bomber gap, and then later a missile gap with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower was very nervous about what he thought might be happening. Was there really a bomber gap or not? Well, they tried to do things like take existing airplanes and try to get them to higher altitude and see if they could overfly the Soviet Union. The best we ever did was we took a variant of the B-57 Canberra, put on extra long wings, and it got up to around high 50s, maybe low 60,000 feet. Wasn't quite high enough. A couple of those got shot down. Okay, we got to go higher than that. And somehow the sense was that if you got over 65 or 70,000 feet, that the first thought was you'd be beyond the range of Russian radar. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but you were beyond the range of the early SAMs or Russian fighters. And so the order came to Lockheed to build the U-2, or to build an airplane that could fly at 70,000 feet or above and had enough range to overfly and do reconnaissance over the Soviet Union, including Moscow. So the airplane was put together. Now, if you look at it very carefully, and I haven't shown you the ideal pictures, but if you compare them sometime, this is one of the original U-2s, first flight in August of 1955. If you look carefully at that fuselage, and especially the structure inside, you recognize that it's the same fuselage that the P-80 used. One of the mantras of the Skunk Works is you never reuse stuff. You reuse stuff whenever you can. And so if there's a part from a previous airplane that works, use it. And so, in fact, we did. So you put in a bigger engine than the P-80 had, and you put on glider wings, and you create a U-2. To keep the airplane light, for example, if you've ever watched a U-2 take off, you can find them on YouTube. You'll see that it has a gear here and a small tail wheel here. There's no landing gear, no main gears in the wing. It's got 2 little pogo sticks that stick out of each wing when it's on the ground. There are titanium rub blocks at the end of the wing. And when the airplane takes off, when it gets enough lift under its wing, the pogo sticks drop out. People come pick them up, right? Because why carry around landing gears? That's a lot of weight, and weight means altitude. And when the airplane lands, which requires a chase car, part of that I think is the romanticism. The pilots like to follow it in a chase car. But nevertheless, they'll follow it in a chase car to watch it settle down onto the runway. When it gets down slow enough, probably 10 knots or thereabouts, a really good pilot will eventually tip over onto one of the titanium skids. They come out, put the pogos on it, and then they can take it back. Airplane flew at, as I said, 70,000 feet. There are some of the early program manager, Fred Kavanaugh and Bob Schumacher was a test pilot. You'll notice that if you look in this photograph today, this is one of the modern U-2s. That's that was built in the 1960s. It looks a lot like the ours that were built in the 1980s. You'll notice, Sandy, that suit should look a little bit familiar to you. So they fly in the same suit that we use on the space shuttle. And if you look at the suits that they wore back in the 1960s, they were these gray tight suits. They were all laced up like you're inside of a sausage when they strapped you into it. But of course, at 55,000 feet, your blood boils. So you got to be in a pressure suit with oxygen to be able to tolerate the conditions. The airplanes were built in the 1950s. Those airplanes are long since gone. There were about 80 or so that were built in the 1950s. I think 86. There were a few more, maybe around 13 or so, that were built. Those numbers aren't quite right. That were built in the 1960s. And then there was the modern batch were built in the 1980s. Been a total of 103 that have been built. There are still 34 that are flying today, 2 of which came from the 1960s. The rest are from the 1980s. So when you hear this story that the U-2 is a 50-year-old airplane, no, it's not. It's actually one of the newest airframes in the entire Air Force inventory. They were built in the late 1980s. They are not old airplanes, and they've been modernized, new engines, et cetera, since that length of time. A couple of interesting things about them. This happens to be a picture in 1969, but this is a U-2 taken off of an aircraft carrier. They wanted to give the airplanes an opportunity to go beyond what would be their normal flying range, and in order to modify it for an aircraft carrier, they did a couple of things to it. They gave it a tail hook. They also have about the outer 6 feet of the 2 wings will fold up. I think there were three of these that were built. The airplane has enough lift and oomph that you can actually get it off the deck of a carrier without a catapult. It normally takes about 1,700 feet and 110 knots to get one off the ground. But if you get, say, 30 knots of wind coming down the deck, which is not all that hard with a bit of sea breeze and under a bit of steam, you can knock that number about in half. 30 knots of headwind will knock it down from 1,700 feet to about 800 feet. And if you use a little bit of flaps, you can get it down, probably down to about 500 or 600 feet, which is more than enough to get it off of a carrier if you don't rip the flaps off in the process of doing that. But that's how they were launched, and they were recovered in that regard. So a pretty remarkable airplane. Well, it turned out that the prediction that Kelly made was that the U-2 would be a good airplane to use until about 1958, and then it would become vulnerable to integrated air defenses in Russia. Well, he was wrong. It was 1960. In May 1960, Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. He was flying from Turkey up to Scandinavia, over top of Moscow. Was intercepted. No one ever was able to intercept a U-2 in a fighter, but they intercepted it with an air-to-air missile. And the airplane went down, and Eisenhower stopped the overflight. So now the question is, what do you do next to get around that? Well, altitude wasn't enough, so how about going for altitude and speed? By the way, if you don't know this, the U-2 was originally put under contract by the CIA and not by the Air Force. The Air Force wasn't particularly interested in it, right? One other little sidebar comment I should have made earlier on is that the F-104, which was our first Mach 2 fighter, that airplane also had the same fuselage as the P-80. So I won't dwell on the 104. It's really a quite remarkable jet, but nevertheless, the same fuselage was in the P-80, the 104, and the U-2. But anyway, back now to the next story. The SR-71 was the name that it got when it eventually flew for the Air Force, but originally it flew for the CIA. It took us 22 months to build the very first one. What's even more remarkable about that, it was the first airplane that actually used titanium in it. And we didn't have the foggiest idea how to machine. If you ever tried to machine titanium using conventional techniques, it doesn't work. So entirely new techniques had to be developed to machine the titanium, to weld it. You couldn't get cadmium tools around it. There are a lot of things that had to be done differently to make an airplane out of titanium, but that was all done. And the airplane, the A-12, first flew in April of 1962. So just a couple of years ago, we had the 50th anniversary of that first flight. The CIA was very pleased with the airplane, and the Air Force then got impressed with it as well. And the Air Force decided they wanted them too. The Air Force wanted one that had 2 seats in it, and so the fuselage was lengthened by about 9 feet, and that became the SR-71. The last U-2 flight, the last A-12 flight, the CIA version, was used over Vietnam in about 1967. Then they were retired. It was just SR flights. This airplane, interestingly enough, in addition to being able to fly at 85,000 feet or more and fly at Mach 3.5 or more, those things, we can say publicly, it also had a controlled radar signature. And here's a picture of it up on a radar test pole in New Mexico, having its radar signature tested. Didn't use all the mathematical modeling, et cetera, that we used later for the 117, but nevertheless, intuitively, there were things that were done like putting these chimes on that helped control the radar signature of the airplane. One interesting side story is, why is it called the A-12? It's because the first 11 didn't work. That does not mean they were built or crashed. It meant the design didn't close in some form or another. So when we talk about being willing to take risk and have things fail in the Skunk Works, we're serious about it. And 12 of them, I think, is good evidence that people are willing to stick to their guns and actually be able to go off and do that. So the airplane then became the SR-71. It flew until the late 80s, was retired, and a couple of them were brought back out of retirement that were used during the 90s and finally retired in the late 1990s. Considering where it was being utilized, the notion was that the U-2 could provide all the things that the SR-71 did at the time. Cold War was over, and so the airplane was retired again. It's pretty expensive to operate the airplane. But this airplane overflew all kinds of places. We used to occasionally like to use it to sonic boom people on the ground that we didn't like. We sonic boomed the Hanoi Hilton a few times to make sure the guys knew that we still knew they were there. There was one time there were a couple of world leaders of people we didn't particularly like. We had two SRs do a twin pass and boom them right in the middle of their speech, just so they knew that we were there with impunity, and indeed we were. But that's the SR-71. Some people think the most remarkable airplane ever. You can see the folks on top. Kelly was the program manager. Ben Recce, who became Kelly's successor, was the one who did the propulsion on the airplane. There was an Interceptor version of it built called the YF-12A that never went into production, but it had air-to-air radars in it, carried Hughes missiles, et cetera. But the intent was to actually use it to intercept Soviet bombers on their way in. A couple built as test platforms. It was never put in as operational, however, but that was the third variant. So we had the A-12, the SR-71, and the YF-12A. The SR, I think you've all heard the story. Why is it the SR-71? Well, originally it was the RS-71. And Lyndon Johnson, when he went public with it, got the letters messed up. Maybe it had a scotch or something, I don't know. But he got the letters inverted, and once the president says it was SR, it was SR. And that name stuck. Well, we then began signing things like the Open Skies Treaty that said that it was okay to overfly with satellites, but not with airplanes over the Soviet Union. And so the notion was to go to an unmanned drone, which we thought threaded a needle in the treaty at the time. And we built essentially a single-engine unmanned version that was called the D-21. And there in the top, you can see the D-21. Notice it's a slightly smaller version of the same engine that's used on the SR. By the way, the SR engine is a turbo ramjet. These cones in the front move in and out, change the airflow, whether it goes through the compressor or not as the airplane is flying. Very difficult to balance them. These engines were notorious for an event called unstarts, which a lot of you know what those are. Those problems are, for the most part, far more behind us than they were at the time, but nevertheless, it was an issue at the time, and some pilots had some pretty fun rides when one of them would unstart at an unfortunate time. There were a couple of successful launches of D-21s off of SR-71s to prove that it would work. There was that one incident, however, where it went slightly out of control, and the two collided and both destroyed the aircraft as well as the drone, and one of the two pilots was killed in the process. And so at that point, we no longer actually used the SR to carry the drone and began carrying it on the B-52. So the B-52 could launch it at 50,000 feet, but 50,000 feet and 500 knots is not the same thing as 85,000 feet and Mach 3.3, high twos probably carrying that thing on its back. But nevertheless, it was used. How much that was actually ever used is still classified, and I don't even know the details off the top of my head myself. Okay, so we're back to the newer version of the U-2. Kelly Johnson retired in 1975. He was replaced by Ben Recce. And when that happened, one of the things that he did in addition to stealth, which I'll talk about in a moment, is he wanted to bring back the U-2 production line, went to building the so-called U-2R, which is now called the Dragon Lady. The original one was called, the A model was called the Angel. The airplane had a different engine in it, bigger wings in it, higher performance. And if you look at these airplanes today, the amount of power that they can produce in their generator, they can carry 5,000 pounds of payload on their way to 6,000 pounds of payload. So you can see. So here's the U2Rs that were built. They actually started in the 1960s. I misspoke. When Ben Recce restarted the line in the early 1980s, it went to the S model, which is just a minor derivative off of the R. But here you can see what the airplane looks like, test pilots, program managers, and people who worried about the ISR package that the airplane carried. Airplane still flies today, and interestingly enough, it has the heaviest duty cycle it's ever had in its history for use today. The sensor payloads on the airplane are absolutely remarkable. And when you're up at 70,000 feet, you can imagine the kind of angle you have. You can fly along some bad guy's border and look fairly deep. You can do the geometry yourself if you wish to see how far you can look, but it's not trivial. So once it became clear that high wasn't good enough, high and fast wasn't good enough, there were treaties that were written, we already were working on satellites. One little sidebar, for those of you that know Lockheed Sunnyvale, that was actually originally created to build Polaris missiles, and it was actually born out of the Skunkworks. Kelly Johnson went up to Sunnyvale for six or 9 months and set up what later became Space and Missiles within the Lockheed Corporation, built around the Polaris missiles for the Polaris submarines. But so the answer was we clearly had to do something that high and fast wasn't good enough. The Russians had put huge amounts of money into an integrated air defense system. And so the notion was, what can we do to defeat that? Well, the notion was, why don't we figure out a way that we can somehow defeat what were the Russian radars of the day? And so what had happened was, obviously trying to do radar reflections off of say flat plates is not all that hard to do. That's simple kind of optics. But the problem was, what do you do when the flat plates come together, along things like that? Well, that was a real problem. Well, in the late 1960s, a couple of Russian mathematical physicists solved the diffraction equation for that edge. And a couple of our guys, Dennis Overholzer and Shearer was the other person's name, discovered this paper and wanted to incorporate that diffraction model into the radar cross-section models of the day, and it made a prediction. So internal money, they then went off and they built an object that was called the Hopeless Diamond. They could stick up onto a stand, and when they did, there was no radar signature. So now the challenge became, how do you make that thing fly? Well, DARPA and the Air Force each paid a third. Actually, they were supposed to both pay a half, but then there was a cost overrun, so we paid it, and it ended up being a third, till you were all said and done with it, right? Built an airplane that was called Have Blue. It first flew in 1977. This was now under the leadership of Ben Recce. The airplanes, there were 2 of them built. One of them had, in addition to the geometry, had RAM coating on it for radar absorbing. The second one didn't. So one was primarily evaluate flight characteristics. The other one was looking at radar cross sections, et cetera. But that airplane, here's the pole model version of it. You can see what it does. Here are the 2 airplanes that were flying. And lo and behold, it was, in fact, invisible to radar at the time. The interesting thing about that airplane, if you look at it, the only thing in that airplane that is actually new is the dust cover. Engines, landing gears, cockpit, everything, inertial nav system came out of existing aircraft, landing gears, right? The only thing that's new about the airplane is the dust cover and the flight control system to make an airplane of that shape fly, which it did. And funny story that was interesting about this, when they first went to demonstrate this, they had it up on a pole, and the military came to look at the airplane to see if they wanted to actually follow on with a operational version that became the F-117. They put it out in the range, which is out in California at the time, still is. They turn on the radars and they can see the airplane. Oh God, what happened? Well, somebody looks in the binoculars, it was a bird. So somebody runs out, chases the bird away. They do it again. Signature is less, but it's not 0. Well, what happened? Well, the bird left a present, or so the story goes. That was cleaned off, and lo and behold, the radar signature went back to nothing, which is exactly what they predicted that it would be. Well, the results of that were so remarkable that gave rise to the F-117. The F-117, you can see Ben Recce was the head of ADP by that time. The program manager for this was Norm Nelson. By this time, they had fallen into a structure that was more or less reminiscent of at least the part of the Skunkworks that I'm responsible for today. And here you can see the people that are across this. And here you can see the Nighthawk's capability was proven in both of the Iraq wars. The individual who actually led that raid the first night into Iraq in 1991 is the deputy to our program development vice president. His name is Greg Feast. Some of you may know him, call sign Beast. But when he tells the story of that first night's raid into Iraq, he said as they crossed the border from Kuwait into Iraq, everybody checked in before they went radio silent. Last guy checks in and says, "I sure hope this stuff works." And in they go, and on the way back, Greg was the first guy in, he was the first guy out. One by one, people check in. When they got back out, all of them came back. And in fact, they flew 1,200 sorties during that war, and they never had a single bullet hole or piece of shrapnel. That's how well it did against integrated air defenses. There were a total of 59 of those built, all built by hand. Quite frankly, that one almost choked us. 59 airplanes of that complexity is a lot for something to be done in a Skunkworks type of environment. But nevertheless, they were built. The airplanes flew until the mid-2000s, around 2005 or thereabouts. They were maintained under contract to us up until that time when the aircraft were in fact retired. Well, it turns out about 1990, there was a lot of pressure from the city. Somebody in Burbank had the idea that, well, maybe we can make Burbank the airport for the LA base and we'll take over for LAX. So they wanted Lockheed to leave. Well, a little bit north of town, about 60 miles north of Burbank, in the town called Palmdale, we had built a large plant to build L-1011s in Palmdale. So here's the large hangar where airplanes were assembled. Here's where they were painted. These were the places where the L-1011 was built. There were about 250 of those built there during the 70s and early 80s, then went dormant. And when we chose to leave Burbank in 1990, between 1990 and 1994, the operations that were here in Burbank moved up to Palmdale. We also had a facility in Ontario that we closed, and those individuals moved up to Palmdale as well. And the Burbank site was gone. It was cleaned up, and now there's virtually nothing left. A few buildings are left from the original days, but we've now transplanted ourselves into Burbank. So the move happened from Burbank to Palmdale between 1990 and 1994. Well, where are we today? I mean, what are the things that happened in the 1990s to the present from the time that we moved out to Palmdale? Well, first off, one of the things that we're well known for, of course, is the X-30. Whoops. Back up here. The X-35, its ability to do vertical takeoffs. The idea of a lift fan to be able to do that far more controllably than, say, the way a Harrier does it, was actually first, the story goes, it was sketched out on a napkin in a bar. Well, the guy who did that, Paul Bevilacqua, just recently retired from us. It was indeed sketched out in a napkin, but it was in a skiff, not in a bar. But nevertheless, it certainly had promise computationally and from small laptop things we could do in-house. There was then a program funded called Ace Stovall, which you can see sitting here in the corner, that had a turbine engine in it, but that proved you could build a transmission and drive a lift fan off of it. Now, this thing does not fly. It's made out of steel. It's not supposed to fly. But it demonstrated integrating a turbine and a fan into an airplane. It's about a third the size of what's now the X-35. So that's the story of the X-35. One of our first attempts to look at modern composite manufacturing to a large scale happened back in the late 90s, working with the folks in Missiles and Fire Control at Lockheed. They wanted basically a modern stealthy cruise missile. The original construction that was used for that made this thing very expensive to build, maybe $2 million a copy, very expensive. And it also wasn't very stealthy. And so Missiles and Fire Control came to the Skunkworks. We helped them with the design to improve its radar cross-section and took it over to a full composite manufacturing process. And actually, these weapons are now about $200,000 a piece, so a huge decrease in the cost of the weapon when you did that. We built the first 200. The Missiles and Fire Control people always did the weaponization of it. We never did that. We did the part that flew. And after the first 200 and all the things were wrung out of it, it completely migrated over to the Missiles and Fire Control people. It's now made between Orlando, Florida, and Grand Prairie, Texas is where it comes from. But that was our first modern integrated composite structure that, of course, became very important in the F-22 or in the F-35. In terms of unmanned aerial vehicles, Tier 3, which was a government program back in the early part of the 2000s. This was an internally funded one showing a true flying wing configuration, so it has stealthy characteristics, although it's not. About a 90-foot wingspan wingspan in that particular airplane. And it became the predecessor for lots of flying wing designs that you see out there today. One of the more radical things that we've been working on now for quite some time, and the difficulty with it really is a market type thing and willingness to make an investment in it, but is a hybrid vehicle like this. You look at that and say, well, it looks kind of like a blimp, but it looks a little funny. Well, yeah, it's like a blimp that sort of got squished. So if you notice it, you'll notice that it's thinner vertically than it is across. It actually has the shape of a wing. That vehicle gets about 80% of its lift from helium, buoyancy, and the other 20% comes from aerodynamic flow. The airplane rotates at about 11 knots when you fly it to take it off. It's got these fans on the bottom to either help it with vertical takeoffs or to suck it down and hold it in the ground if it gets into a crosswind. But there are designs and plans to be able to build versions of this that carry 20 tons, 70 tons, and maybe 500 tons. And we're hopefully going to get to the point of being able here real soon to start building the prototype for a 20-ton variant. We'll see where that actually ends up in the whole scheme of things. And finally, some of the other things that are out there. There's a larger version of the hybrid that I talked about. This is U-class, which is the Navy unmanned carrier. The Navy is probably close to putting out an RFP for that airplane. We'll see what it looks like and what requirements they finally put on it or not. But certainly, we spent a lot of time working on deck handling and a variety of other things for an airplane that looks like this. Here's one marked near and dear to your heart, HTV-2. That's a hypersonic boost glide vehicle that flies at over Mach 20. Any 2 points on the Earth in less than 1 hour. We've had 2 flights on it from Vandenberg to Kwajalein. Both flights went about just under 10 minutes. One case, an aerodynamic issue caused the flight to terminate. The second time, we changed the flight profile and it overstressed part of the skin. So we certainly would know how to do it, we think, on a third flight if we ever did it. But I think because of the costs that are involved in long tests like that, it's not the vehicle itself, but when you fly a vehicle from Vandenberg to Kwajalein, there's all kinds of assets you got to deploy in the way to measure data, and that gets really expensive and tough to coordinate, ships and airplanes and everything else you can think of. So we're building we're in a competition under DARPA to build a Mach 10 shorter range version of that before we potentially go back to this. This is another DARPA program. In fact, I'm leaving tomorrow to go to the second half of a quarterly program review for it called Ares. Originally started out as a flying Jeep, and it later got turned into this modular design of a remotely piloted semi-autonomous wing with ducted fans in it that can carry a whole variety of different modules. So you want to carry cargo, want to carry wounded troops, you want to bolt one of those lightweight dune buggies to it, whatever you want, you're able to do that. And so this thing is scheduled for flight, the first demo flight of it late next year. Back to the high-speed world, this was originally the original Falcon, but the idea is, can you take an air-breathing vehicle and get it to fly at Mach 10 or thereabouts, or Mach 6? Probably Mach 6 is more like this was intended for Mach 6. But to build an ISR vehicle, so if you've seen something in Aviation Week 6 months ago about the SR-72, that would be the concept, right? The idea of flying at Mach 6, which is about twice the speed of an SR, able to cover a lot of ground very, very quickly. And then finally, one of our real dreams is to someday build a supersonic business jet, regional jet, eventually commercial transport. NASA has, and the Air Force, but NASA in particular has been putting a lot of money into trying to quiet it down to get to fly over land. And if things work out well for NASA, I think they're going to look to have maybe a demo vehicle built at some point in the not too distant future. Obviously, they've got to go through their own process to do that. But I think the time might be about right, because whether it's us or Boeing or Gulfstream and others, we believe that there are now ways. In fact, there was an article just in the last week, Aviation Week, about supersonic jets of this class, where the idea, the term that I like to use, it turn it from a supersonic boom to a supersonic rumble, and see if that's acceptable to how people react to it. We hear sonic booms in Palmdale all the time, and people don't seem to really particularly care about it because it's just where we live. We're close enough to some of the flight corridors from Edwards Air Force Base. In fact, a lot of our guys can oftentimes tell what the airplane is by the way the boom sounds, whether you can actually hear it double it or not. I heard a doublet last week, and it was probably an F-22. It's a big enough airplane to be able to do that. But those are some of the things in the future. I will tell you that 87% of what we do is classified. So occasionally someone will say to me, well, geez, you guys haven't done anything for 10 years. What are you doing now? Well, 10 years from now, I'll tell you what we're doing now. But you're going to have to wait until I actually go off and I do that. So that is the history, the family album of the Skunkworks from 1943 to the present. We have time for a few questions if anybody has any. Read Ben Rich's book. You'll find it a fascinating read. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Go ahead. The question was, what replaced the 117? The idea was that the F-35 would ultimately be the replacement for the 117. So right now, the Marine Corps version of the F-35 goes IOC next year in 2015. So right now there's a gap, right? But the notion was that between the F-22 and the B-2, we could kind of cover the gap for the 117 until the F-35 went operational. Now, obviously, I'm an airplane nut. I would have kept the 117 just because it was cool. I'd have kept the SR too. They're just cool, right? But there are such things as budget realities. And there's also political realities of how you get programs funded. So the intent is the F-35 will replace the 117. Yeah.
So Lockheed Martin builds more than airplanes. They
Right.
build satellites, and before United Launch Alliance, they built rockets. So why don't I see those kind of products being
Because the
fostered?
Skunkworks doesn't do those. The way we're organized, there is no corporate laboratory per se at Lockheed Martin. Most companies in the US have gotten rid of the large corporate laboratories. And so there are R&D groups of some form or another in each one of the parts of the business that do those things. So for example, it's called the Advanced Technology Center in Sunnyvale. They just recently changed their name to something called the Star Lab, but it's so new I don't even remember it myself. Because it's literally weeks ago that the name changed. They're intended to do the R&D to support satellites, right? There's a group in Denver that will support rocket development. Now, all that being said, we do partner with those, just like I mentioned on the JASM. So if not so much on the space vehicles per se, except for maybe looking at airspace integration or communications and the like. But when it comes to launch type activities, if it's something that flies in the atmosphere non-ballistically, the idea of a booster that returns to base or whatever it might be, the folks in space will come to us to work with them to be able to do that. So if it flies, if you can't just go buy it at the corner store and it flies in the atmosphere, other parts of Lockheed Martin will use us, and space is a classic example. But when you think about developments with radars or missiles or rockets or satellites, each one of those businesses within Lockheed has a development group that does those activities.
Do you find that security restrictions limit your ability to be innovative, that you can't get the appropriate resources on a particular project or respond to an RFP, give somebody your resume of things?
No, actually we don't. And the reason I would say that is that if you take a look at, principal customers like DARPA, AFRL, some from ONR, and other specialized parts of the government where the secret work is done for, they know what you've done in the past. You don't really have to worry about that. There are some people, a lot of times you'll get a young person that comes out of school, maybe says, well, I want to go teach someday. And maybe they feel that they'll be able to put Skunkworks on their resume, but they may not have the publications because, ones that they write might end up being classified. Although, usually the basic work that you do can be published. So if you take a look at AIAA meetings, my guys will come here with a lot of papers. This isn't a particularly strong one for us, but is Jeff still here? Do you have any idea how many papers we took, say, to SciTech? 30? It was at least 30 papers or so. So, the fundamental stuff you can still publish. Some of what we do is not classified. You can do it. Does not really seem to be a big problem.
Okay, thank you.
The bigger issue, of course, for anyone in this business and many of you can relate to this, is that you only can hire U.S. citizens. And then there's all kinds of other restrictions. They can never have done this, that, or the other things that sometimes young people do that they wish maybe later they hadn't. Yeah.
You didn't mention X-33 VentureStar. Any comments on that?
Well, I think what I would say for X-33 VentureStar, there's a long story behind that, if anyone knows what it was, but that was a case where we actually partnered with space, right? It was a joint program. And interestingly enough, the way the story goes is that was supposed to be a composite fuel tank. You know, and our concern was that the composite fuel tank wouldn't actually work. We wanted to actually have at least a metal tank as a backup. And in fact, the company president, the Lockheed president at the time, actually even went to the government and said, we'll pay for it ourselves. We want to build a metal tank as a backup, and the government refused to do that. And then when the composite tank failed the way we predicted it would fail, the program was canceled, right? But that's a good example of how we would work with space on a project. But we learned a lot, we can fail at the Skunkworks, but we learned a lot from that. And when these subsequent, single stage to orbit kinds of things come along, our learnings from that still exist. I don't know which one of you got up first.
Yeah. What do you look for when you bring someone into Skunkworks, and what is it that makes someone a skunk worker?
Well, we call them skunks. How do you make a skunk? Well, interestingly enough, a lot of it's culture. So first off, you have to have somebody who really is into curiosity. And not all engineers would be good skunks. In fact, many engineers would not be good skunks because they like things very, very regimented. And so an engineer that has trouble dealing with ambiguity probably would not do well in our environment, because they might be working on this for 2 weeks, and then next week they're going to work on something totally different. And then 3 weeks later they're going to work on something totally different. And a lot of people, so in fact, my exec, where is she? Over there. Her husband works for us. He went from working on 100-knot hybrids, to Mach 6 vehicles 1 week to the next. And a lot of engineers will freak out if they have to make a gear change like that. So it's someone who's able to handle that change. It's also important to have really good intuition about things that are mechanical and electrical. So it's interesting that I'm going to put a plug in here for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. We hire engineers from all over the country. Purdue is big, Georgia Tech is big, Michigan is big, Texas is big, Arizona State are big. Number of the California schools, Stanford, USC are big. Another one that's really big is Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And you'll also find what I'm about to say true of some kids from Big Ten schools. But the classic Cal Poly San Luis Obispo kid grew up in the Central Valleys of California. Boy or girl probably fixed their first tractor when they were 4 years old. I'm being a little bit melodramatic. And then they went off to school at Cal Poly, Central California, closer to the coast, to learn engineering per se. And when they show up at our place, they've been building stuff since they were 4 years old. But beyond that, they just want to get out there and build stuff. So they're maybe not the ones who do all the crazy designs of thermodynamic cycles and a hypersonic flow or whatever it might be, but they build stuff. And they're very, very good at it. We find a lot of kids from Texas A&M that are like that as well. But the thing that's interesting is I think trying to create a Skunkworks today in aviation would be difficult. If we have time here at the end, I'll tell you why I think it was created when it did. But I think what happens is the culture self-perpetuates. So every generation comes along and teaches the next, and sort of how the culture works. I can't write down the secret sauce and put it in a jar. If I could probably be a rich consultant, but I don't know how to do that because it just seems one generation seems to infect the next as they move on. And by the way, we've got 1,200 people in California. There are also 450 skunks I think that's right, in Fort Worth, and about 100 that are in Marietta. Now, interestingly enough, if you trace back the lineage of those groups before they joined the Skunkworks in one of our reorganizations, they were the advanced development groups that either did large transport airplanes for Lockheed, Georgia, or they were the ones that did, for example, the F-16, General Dynamics. They came from similar backgrounds, and actually, there's projects that are managed out of Palmdale, and the work gets done in Fort Worth, or it gets done in Marietta, or it's managed out of Fort Worth, and there's guys at both other places working on it. We're pretty ambivalent to, the airlines love us because we're pretty ambivalent to location. So, yeah.
So Al, you talked about the SR-72 article last September. Is there one of those Mach 6 airplanes in our future?
I sure hope so. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, I think if you talk to I think it's interesting. Hypersonics are one of those things. First off, nobody really knows, right? No one has a program to do that. No one's even seriously talking about a program to do that per se. But I think there's clearly a rising interest in hypersonics that are inside the government, right? You can see that with, our persistence. We got the X-51 to work, demonstrated hypersonic combustion. We got those things to work. There is the Hawk proposal that just came down the pike out of DARPA. So there's enough things that are happening where I think there's an interest. And hypersonics is one of those things that when I was a graduate student, it was 30 years away. Now I don't think it's 30 years away. I think it's 5 years away or thereabouts. So I think if we get over a few of these demonstration hurdles and some of these things work, I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that you could someday see a vehicle like that built. But certainly at this point, it's no more than a twinkle in a few people's eyes. But I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. So with that, I think probably, let me tell you one more thing, and then we'll open the bar. And the one more thing is people will sometimes say to me, could you create a Skunkworks today? And my answer to that question is yes and no. I think that in the area of aviation, the answer is no. And the reason that I say that is go back, and in fact, for some of you who know me long enough, I actually spent the first part of my career building nuclear weapons, which has got a similar kind of lineage going back to World War II. And I saw the same kind of effects, at a Los Alamos and a Sandia that I see at a place like the Skunkworks. But think about what it was like in the 1940s and the 1930s. In the 1930s and 40s, aviation was like, the internet buzz was in the 1990s and how wireless stuff is today. And look at all the famous people that appeared, the Jack Northrops, the Howard Hughes, the Kelly Johnsons, the Curtises. I mean, the list is long. Bill Boeings that came along in that period because it was a rapidly growing, rapidly advancing technology. So you had an area of discipline that was rapidly maturing and going up a very steep curve, far more immature than it is today. I mean, think about going from Sopwith camels to jet-powered flight in a matter of less than 20 years, or about 20 years. I mean, really remarkable. So part of it was the right age, right maturity state for aviation. The second thing was we were in a war where our threat was existential against us. Right? We might have really lost that war, and it would have been the end of the U.S., and people knew that, and so therefore resources were unlimited or unconstrained, right? So you had rapidly maturing technology, unconstrained resources, and a few magic people, one of whom happened to be Kelly Johnson. And so the birth of the Skunkworks is rapidly maturing field, infinite dollars, and a magical person, and the spark created the Skunkworks. And I would say that today resources are not unlimited because it's primarily government, one, and I think two, it's a much more mature field. And the people that tend to have that spark probably go into something else that's new. They're now doing things in the world of electronics, the internet, wireless, whatever it might be. So I think you could argue that things like Apple and others are really Skunkworks-like in terms of how they function, but they're in different industries than we are today. And so it all gets back to the culture question that if what I just said is true, that flash, it happened in 1943 that created the Skunkworks, created a culture that has infectiously passed from one generation to the next, and it's still there today. And we also, quite frankly, have a very, very, understanding and proud parent. Every sign that we get from Lockheed Martin and from Lockheed Martin Aeronautics is just extreme support for the notion of having something like a Skunkworks. They know that it's very special. And they even though most of the funds that we have are actually generated out of the government, we do receive a good baseline out of Lockheed Martin. But there is no doubt from Marilyn Hewson, who runs Lockheed, to Orlando Carvalho, who has Aeronautics, Rob Weiss, who has the coordination across all of Palmdale and the larger ADP that we have today. To a person, they are really committed, to the notion of what the magic that the Skunkworks has. And we're thankful for that every day. So, is the bar open, Sandy?